I'm Kat Singer, and my pronouns are they, them. I describe myself as a multimedia artist. I dabble in a whole range of media. In my bio, I say ever-expanding range. Drawing, painting, sculpture, printmaking, recently these ones, so like on textiles. So this is kind of like my work in progress. It is a self-portrait of what I've been doing for the past 2-something years, which is, turning into rainbow goo, hopefully to be reconstructed into something else, something better, but who knows. This piece, I don't know the final title yet. One of the potential working titles is What Dreams May Come, from Hamlet and from Rob Williams' movie about hell, which I saw when I was young, and it really impressed me, and I think it's like among one of my inspirations of becoming an artist later. This is basically a portrait of myself that I've recreated with felt, which is a living material. This is all dyed sheep's wool and some of it alpaca wool that's been compressed together with these little barbed needles. It makes a very satisfying sound. This is hours and hours of work. And part of the past 2 years is that time has been very, very queer. The figure is depicted as, in this slumber. Diapause, the word actually really intrigued me, so I did some research about it. It happens to mostly smaller critters. Sometimes they freeze in time in order to, come to life again. It happens to certain kinds of embryos. They become suspended in time, and then when they, reawaken, they go on to develop into something further. So I'm hoping that that's what's going to happen to me as an artist, as a human. But really, I don't know what's going to happen when we all wake up out of this. So first, you have this matter. This is like sheep's wool. It's kinky in texture, kind of like my hair. This is like some pieces of the work in progress. You take a needle with barbed edges, and you can see it makes, when you felt, you press the needle in, and that compacts the wool and makes it bond with each other until, for example, you get a shape that you want. For example, this is the shape. You can layer different colors, and once you get it into a shape, you can combine it with other shapes for different effect. As you can see with this, the faces that have been built in layers upon the surface of the couch, and the faces for me represent kind of like memories having to do with people. I would felt a layer on, and then I would take a little bit more wool and, for example, apply it to something where I feel there isn't enough, surface. Grab a needle, and you can see the layer, as I push it in, becomes integrated into the surface almost seamlessly. One of my artistic inspirations is the work of Louise Bourgeoise, who is a sculptor, pretty well known, and a lot of her works have to do with her lived experience and learning to understand and interpret it. Some of my works in the Unravel series, which are figurative works, for example, this work called Good Grief. It's about my personal experience of, trying to make sense of this emotion. I've noticed that in my own work and in her work, there is this idea of rhizomes, which is a way of how roots and branches tend to split up. A good example of rhizomes is ginger. If you can imagine how it splits up, it's a natural pattern. And I found that my experience is sometimes kind of rhizomatic in the way that it splits off. For example, these are my early textiles of this is my textile depiction of how I experience anxiety, and this one is how I experience more of what's a mood that's attracted the label of depression, and I was trying to make sense of that first in printmaking, then these ones, and I've been trying to make sense of my experiences and how they split off for a very, very long time, This is something that I made when I just started crocheting. It wasn't meant to be an artwork when I was about 20 years old. So now it's like over a decade of artistic growth. You can see how my ways of expressing myself have evolved. One of the wonderful discoveries and miracles that came out of this project is, for the first time, I've had a kind of materials budget, which has allowed me to really explore with the materials that I wanted. It's really like a huge gift for artists to be able to do that, because normally I use stuff that's widely available. This is recycled materials, this is recycled fabric, this is the cheapest acrylic yarn that was available, but it feels plasticky. It's not quite alive, and it's a lot more difficult to imbue life into a synthetic material, at least for me. When I was able to work with something that's already, that's already organic and alive, it was completely different, and I was able to capture some of that life in my work.